Hi, I'm Dan McClure. I work for ThoughtWorks, an international consultancy on innovation and technology, and my job is looking at how to do complex innovation better. There are a lot of challenges in this space right now, and one of the biggest is simply realizing the need for complex innovation and the move away from simple solutions. There's a lot of us looking right now at how to leverage change to make high impact improvements in the nature of response, the nature of operations, and working in a complex world. What we've discovered is that it's really, really hard to do that. The problem is, even though it's really, really hard, everyone is trying to make it easy. And this has led to a lot of failures. Think back to the whole innovation trend that began about 7 or 8 years ago. We saw the addition of lots of pilot programs, the inclusion of fail fast, and a lot of ideation and brainstorming with the idea of bringing small, easily testable ideas to market and test them out. That scaling would then be run through a series of lean, fail fast, test and learn kind of pilots, which would give us minimum viable products. And that was all very exciting because for a sector that was focused on doing sort of very staid and long-term planning, this felt very fast and easy moving. The challenge is that none of these pilots were actually going to scale. It was as if we had learned how to breed baby bunnies, and we had lots and lots of little pilots, but nobody who was a big, high-impact solution that actually was a long-term success. Why is that? When we started looking at the reasons for that, what we saw was pilots are basically designed around simplified speed for learning. You have situations where you basically want to strip down a problem as much as possible so that you can quickly learn about it and quickly test to determine if it's a good idea. In comparison, when you're looking at a replicable solution, the sort of thing that you could take through a normal management process and replicate it and standardize it, that requires a lot of structure and a lot of well built out understandings of how all the pieces fit together. These two models are almost completely unrelated to one another. One is stripped down, the other one's very formal and structured. There's a missing middle that scaling needed to go through. And what we found with that missing middle is that it was complex, multiple dimensions that needed lots of additional work to move from the simplified pilot to the replicable solution. This complexity is a form of innovation that we really don't have a lot of experience and capability of dealing with. Let's take a simple example here. Here we have a traditional little green pilot down in the lower left-hand corner of a piece of technology, and we want to deploy that out into the real world. Well, if you look at the diagram, there's lots of different things that need to go on. We need to figure out how to do the design. We need to figure out how to onboard new users. We need to figure out how to support questions. Who's going to be doing long-term product strategy? What's the money model, business model going to be like? All of these different pieces need to be in place if you're going to create a sustainable long-term solution. And that's a lot of complex change that needs to happen. It's not surprising at all that scaling doesn't happen when you look at all these pieces that need to be added to that initial promising pilot. What we find is that this move towards complexity and the need for complexity starts showing up in a lot of different places. The Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, basically pose harder problems for NGOs and others working in the aid sector. Because what they say is it's no longer enough to move a bag of rice or deliver a tent to an area of need. We now need to make systemic change that reduces the long-term reliance on aid. If we want to have impactful solutions, we see that we need much more complicated pieces pulled together. And if, as part of the grand bargain, we want to drive the participation revolution, then we need much more inclusivity of communities and local groups, and that involves a lot more complexity. So this complexity, the challenge of complex innovation, is almost everywhere in what we're trying to do. Unfortunately, our toolkit is really designed around much simpler problems. There was a phrase, wicked problems, that describe these sort of complex multidimensional problems. The reverse of that would be tame problems. And that's what we've seen here, is that innovation has really been designed around the tame problems of change. So for example, we have reductionist engineering, where you basically break a problem into small parts, analyze each piece, and then deliver them according to a plan. This is the kind of thing that you would use if you were building a road. There's incremental improvement, which allows you to advance ideas by making small incremental changes. And there's exploratory pilots, the sort of lean startup, let's try lots of new ideas. Each one of these has been simplified in a key way to avoid complexity. The reductionists simplify things by basically assuming that they actually know more than they do, and that they can control the world. So they convene, they decide, they plan, they execute, and measure as if they were living in a world where they knew all the details and could manage all the change. This produces this sort of top-down control and linear stage gate models of many project management systems. The problem is, you don't. And that means that if you've got these complex problems where there's lots of dimensions and there's lots of uncertainty, the reductionist will be unable to respond to it. The incremental innovator was really championed by W. Edwards Deming in the automotive industry in the 1960s. And the basic model here is, rather than try to understand all the complexity of the world, what we'll do is we'll measure the output of a system, make a small change, and see if it improves. Now, this is wonderful because we can basically treat the entire system of the world, whether it's a factory or some other big process, as a black box. And we simply make changes to it and see how it affects the outputs. This is wonderful for making small incremental improvements to a complex system. The problem is, those small incremental improvements need to stay small, because as soon as you make a big change, the fundamental assumption that the system can be measured and that you won't get cascading effects is lost. And so incremental improvements like Deming and total quality management and ISO 9000 are all based on, is basically about making small change, but not big high impact change. And for the exploratory innovator, the lean startup pilot person, they often find themselves saying, we're going to narrow a problem so that we can easily test it and go out and fail fast. We're going to learn quickly, and we're going to basically get as many ideas tested as possible. And that's great because it allows for very quick idea exploration. Unfortunately, in the long run, the arbitrary simplicity that they've assigned to the problem doesn't mask the fact that there's actual complexity behind it. And so eventually, these simplified problems need to deal with the big complexity. So we find ourselves as in a position as innovators where there's lots of big problems that are all complex, and a toolkit that's really not well designed for dealing with these big complex problems. And the space that we're working in, that we believe we need to work in, is this upper right-hand area of areas of unknowns and uncertainty, plus large-scale problems. What these problems have are the typical features of a wicked problem. Diverse domains, conflicting interests, there's no right solution, there's nonlinear feedback, so you get chaotic cascading behaviors, uncertainty, unknowns, ongoing change. You can't even know what you know about a solution because it's constantly changing. This is not the kind of world that's easy to work in, but it's not impossible to work in either. And that's what complex innovation and the people who are working with more bigger system change are wrestling with today. So how might we do that? Well, first, we've got to realize that some of the techniques of the past, where we would assume that we could chip off maybe the best 20% of the problem space. You know, this is what Pareto talked about with the Pareto rule, which said you get 80% of the value from 20% of the effort. That kind of thinking, that we're going to deal with a small piece of the problem and get a lot of value from it, works if you're doing with small incremental improvements, but it doesn't work with big systems. My favorite example of this is the initial days of 3D movies. For all the excitement about 3D movies today, it's worth remembering in the 1950s, there was a whole 3D movie craze that came about for almost all the same reasons that we see it today. Movies were competing with the new thing called television, and they wanted to get people into the theater. And the idea of 3D movies was really exciting. So they got directors to direct movies. They got movie cameras to film movies. They got writers to write the movies. And they did the entire production of 3D films. The last step in the process, though, was having the films projected in a theater. And when you project a 3D movie with that old technology in the theater, what you needed to do was have two different movie cameras, one for projecting each eye. As long as they were perfectly in sync, it was an exciting experience. But if you get those two cameras just slightly out of sync, something that was really easy to do in an everyday movie theater, everybody in the movie theater throws up. What this shows you is that you can have an entire system in place. The directors, the writers, the filming, and one piece of a system can be dysfunctional and the entire system collapses. And this is the nature of complex system changes. So we no longer get to cherry pick the best pieces, but we have to deal with the system as a whole. So it's hard, and we've got to stop trying to make it easy. How do we do that? Well, first, we embrace the idea that the problem space we're working on is messy. And there's a concept here called brackish water, which has some interesting history from an evolutionary perspective. If you look at salt water on one side and fresh water on the other side, the place where they mix is called brackish water. And the ecological diversity in salt water is often about the same as with fresh water. But the place where they mix, where there's salt and fresh water, and there's variations going on, there's a sudden explosion in creative evolutionary possibilities there. And so you see the ecological diversity in brackish water often spikes up. That's the kind of thinking that we want to stimulate when we're talking about systems. Instead of becoming specialists in one small area or another small area, we want to be broad thinking. We want to see across multiple domains, mixed domains that normally don't go together. We want to build brackish water in our thinking. Now, the second piece is we're starting out with this sort of bigger view of the world. We need to shift our management model. We already talked a little bit about the idea of linear command and control, which you see there on the left-hand side. Linear command and control assumes that somebody can make a specification, and then the job of management is to assure that that specification has been complied with. So compliance is what you're measuring. That's one way of managing risk, because you basically assume if we know what to do, it's just a matter of doing it. But in an uncertain, messy world, we don't necessarily know what to do. So we need a different model for managing risk. And that would be what you see on the right-hand side, is managing risk through learning loops. And the idea here is that we come up with an idea, we test it, we see what the outcome is, and then we learn and pivot. The result of this is that we have a way of essentially taking steps through uncertainty and complexity by testing something, adjusting our path, and going in a new, better direction. Imagine you're trying to walk across town to a restaurant you've never been to, and you don't have explicit directions. You might go a little bit one way, realize that you've gone out of the direction you should, adjust back and go the next direction. That's the sort of wandering path towards a destination that we're going to try to achieve. Now, what's great about this is that this is the learning model that's already been applied in a lot of user-centered design, in a lot of agile development. And it can be applied more broadly across the entire enterprise. So we have the opportunity to take the concept of learning loops and really apply it to the executive vision, the measurement of portfolio value, as well as the actual delivery team. And this becomes then a powerful tool for creating an enterprise that's about dealing with complex challenges. There's a big shift when you move from pilot to this evolving complexity. Pilots are all about short-term, small funding, low risk, because everything is kept small. The journey through building a complex system is not short-term, it's long-term, and it requires commitment. So unlike a large project which might be planned out explicitly that you can test and measure compliance along the way, here we're building out an early version of the system and then evolving it towards a guiding vision. And this is a much different type of journey, because while we set the guiding vision at the end, it isn't our firm specification. Instead, what it is, it's a place where we think we want to go, and we evolve our solution in that direction. We may adjust the form of the solution, or we may even adjust the ultimate outcome, but we're basically adjusting all the way along on multiple dimensions. This takes time, and it takes commitment, and it takes a team that can deal with complex choices as they're going along. So one of the challenges, of course, is that if we're saying we're going to be making these adjustments as we go along, and we're going to be thinking about how we do things in a different way, we need the ability for our supporting tools to also make changes. One of the things that's most frustrating for an organization that's decided that it's going to become more nimble is to discover that its technology and that its processes are all basically locked down and almost unable to change. The great thing about lockdown processes and tools is that they allow you to do something exactly right. And so the whole idea of fully documenting and rigidly enforcing compliance with a set of processes and using a set of technologies that support that is that you get a very replicable process with very consistent performance. Think of that as sort of like the fine-tuned clay model of a motorcycler that you see on the left-hand side. That fine-tuned model, however, is really hard to change. If we want to change that model on the left, we've basically got to break the clay and start from scratch. Now compare that to the motorcycler on the right, which is made out of a whole bunch of Legos. Now in this case, if we decide we want to change the motorcycler, we simply start taking the Legos apart and assembling them in different ways. And that's really where we want to go with technologies and processes, is start breaking them into smaller pieces that can be assembled in different ways so that we can respond to different challenges in different ways, both learning as we're going along, as well as evolving in response to change. So the technology and process platforms we have need to become platforms of innovation rather than platforms of replicable service. What we see is a world where this type of skill, this need to respond to complexity, is becoming more and more a core part of what we're trying to do. We need to build organizations, project management, and technologies around supporting this new type of skill. I think it's a really exciting time because as we get good at moving into this, we can start solving much more complex and much more difficult issues. Thanks much. Hope you found this useful.